Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. Today we're taking a look at the video game Bloodborne, which is one I have an off and on relationship with. I've owned the game for actual years, but I'd never actually played a Soulsborne game, so this was my very first Souls game, and I gotta say, I'm disappointed, at least with the difficulty. Just about every boss in this game was pretty easy on the first playthrough, aside from the first two, because it took me a while to get a grasp on the controls. Father Gascoigne and the Beast on the Bridge. Now, before you make fun, I did not know that the music box could stun Gascoigne, and, I don't say this lightly, I spent the entirety of this game unable to use visceral attacks. The attack where you stagger the enemy by essentially parrying their attacks with Quicksilver bullets and then going in for a high damage move. On subsequent playthroughs, I realized how important this attack is, but it's kind of funny that I got through the first one without a whole aspect of the gameplay, which you can just chalk up to me not paying attention. But other than that, every time I got into it with a boss, I almost felt like I was being tricked with how easy it was, past the first few. But aside from their easiness comes their notoriety. These are indeed some of the coolest bosses I've ever gone toe-to-toe with in a video game, which is awesome. Like Rom the Vacuous Spider, Gehrman the First Hunter, Mikolash, Host of the Nightmare, the Cleric Beast. I probably died more often to normal enemies than the bosses though. And it's a bit funny how mean the enemies in this game are. Like, in other video games, monsters are just monsters that fight wildly, and people are just more controlled versions of those monsters. That's not really the case in this game. These enemies spam attacks, they take half of your health with the most soft baby looking moves, and some of them just plain don't play fair. Perfect example is the dogs and werewolves. Both of these enemies give you very little choice in how to take them out. You either need to stagger or get behind wolves, and you need to basically just hope the dogs don't swarm you. Although I guess the most difficult bosses I faced were the hunters themselves you find scattered around the world. They can heal, they play the most randomly and spontaneously, and they have the best long-range weaponry more often than not. And again, I didn't have visceral attacks for these guys, I just had to wear them down little by little and hope they didn't essentially cheat. Now, you might be thinking I just said a bunch of stuff that makes it seem like this game is really difficult. I mean, when you accuse a game of cheating, that's usually a weak defense that shows that a gamer doesn't know what they're talking about and they never should have been playing the game in the first place. But I think if you played this game, you understand. This game just does not play fair sometimes. There were so many times that the enemies literally spammed attacks, stun-locked me, or just plain did inconsistent damage, and it was the most annoyed I've ever been while playing a video game. For a few examples, the witches that you'll find in Hemwick Charnel Lane, they'll spam Molotovs while those infuriating dogs swarm you, and there was even a time while roaming the tops of buildings that I just kept getting shoved off the map, and if I wasn't shoved completely off, they would spam the shove move, and I don't think I've ever been more infuriated. There were times during the Mikolash boss fight where those little tiny tin men looking guys would half my health with a crossbow shot, and the skeletons that would respawn during the fight, they do even more damage, and you can't even get the health back from hitting them like most enemies. I felt the least frustrated at this game during the boss fights, because when there's more than like 3 enemies at a time, you're in for a rough while. Now, that's not necessarily the game's fault or anything, seeing as I used a slower axe build that makes it difficult to stay on your toes, but still, there were times that this game felt like it punished you for playing, especially the kidnapper enemies. I don't think I've hated a regular enemy more in a video game. They are the meanest, they cheat the hardest, in the lore they experiment on children, or at least kidnap them so they can be experimented on. They get more powerful as you fight them, they don't even look that menacing, they're super ugly, they are bums, they are clowns, they don't play fair, you can only really parry one of their attacks without any risk. They are so annoying. Anyway, back to the lore. That's another hit or miss problem with the game. The lore is a bit too hard to find. Like, I kinda got most of it as it went on, but I do think you have to look really hard to understand the whole story. And I'd go as far as to say that I don't think anyone playing this for the first time understood the whole thing. I like stories that have a lot of elements left unsaid, and obviously in a game where your character doesn't even speak and just is a hunter. I mean, it's not like we really got a character arc. But still, I felt like the Yharnamites never really gave a lot of lore, and it was mostly left to like 3 different people you can speak with, along with a few cutscenes. This game is definitely for gameplay, as are a lot of Soulsborne games from what I've heard. But gameplay and story aren't the only 2 things that make a game. In terms of looks, this game's pretty darn beautiful. I mean, even just the way the look of the game evolves over time. It starts off as a kind of rated R Tim Burton world, filled with characters and enemies that look like Leica designs. Then you get to the Odin Chapel and it starts to look even more exaggerated. The enemies get bigger and more deadly, but the world also starts to feel older and more demented. And even when you reach Old Yharnam, things feel a bit more hellish and undead. Things feel really surreal. Then you get to the Unseen Village, where you kind of start to get a taste of the more alien aspects of the game, but again, it is just a taste. Then we get to the Witches area, where the more mystical parts of the game get to shine, but then we get to the Rom boss fight, and that's when things pretty much go nuclear in terms of design. Everything from there on is a Lovecraftian dream inside of a Lovecraftian nightmare. This game isn't the best looking ever, or even the best looking game of 2015, but it's definitely one of the most well designed ever, constantly feeling so inspired. I mean, you can see the Lovecraftian beings as statues near the Odin Chapel. Even a lot of the sound design in this game is pretty unreal at times. The way these impossible beings sound is so fitting somehow, it's wild. And then obviously the music is absolutely epic. It's like half the reason I like the Mikolash fight so much. It really adds this air of sadness to just about every conflict you fight in. You feel bad for all the Yharnamites who've turned into these beasts you're executing. You feel bad for these noble figures of light who've been brought to their knees and given up. Because how can they fight these godlike eldritch creatures who they don't even know what their intentions are? It's like staring into the face of the ultimate power and somehow finding meaning in all of the killing you do after. In this game's lore, everyone is suffering all at once, and there's not really a way to stop it besides the fact that this is a video game and you need something to fight towards. It's kind of like the old hunters were playing with fire, but the villagers had to suffer the consequences. Things only made worse with the constant use of blood to solve all of their problems. Just look at the entirety of old Yharnam. That's the problem solving and brain power we're working with. I joke that the old hunters were stupid, but honestly, once the old blood stuff started, it was kind of over for everyone, involved or not. The entire game has this air of hopelessness, and that's not really misleading. I mean, really, none of the people of Yharnam can do anything about what's going on without suffering a fate worse than the one they're in right now. Even the little kiddos hanging out just before the Great Bridge behind the locked gate. To her father's a hero who needs to be told to come home now and again. Truthfully, he's just an executioner who slowly turns into the type of beast that requires execution. Now, everything I said probably sounded so cool. Everything I just said probably sounded like a really terrific story, and most of it was just me talking about one boss. That said, it's another double-sided coin of I didn't know that playing through it the first time. He was just some guy to me. I don't mind when a game or movie lets the story go to the back burner a bit, but it almost feels like the game doesn't really want you to know the story. You have to do your own digging, and I wish the lore was a bit more accessible. I also don't mind having to do a subsequent playthrough or two to learn about the story. I mean, look at Interstellar, another story where the only real criticism was that it's hard to comprehend. But in this case, it's more of just the game knowing its story and not understanding that we don't before we play it. We don't know anything about Old Blood or why we should fear it the first time around. This isn't something I'm mad about, but it is a criticism I think is valid. But all of that's not even talking about the fact that 75% of this game's lore comes from DLC, and that is a true crime. I feel like when DLCs have a ton of new content and feel worth it and expansive, it's a good thing. But I do not like when a DLC feels like a second half of the game. That's insulting and stupid, and that's what Mortal Kombat 11 did. But as we start to wrap up this video, I think my closing thoughts are that Bloodborne is just a fantastic game. The way you're almost lured into progressing into areas that feel like they can be explored forever, it's masterclass. And the story, even while a bit difficult to uncover, is actually really interesting and tragic. When you don't know the story, the boss fights are just boss fights, but when you do know the story, it feels like you're going toe-to-toe with monsters, unholy beasts, and legends. But as to why the game is so horrifying, I think it's just the idea that there are no happy endings for a single character in this game except for like one. The Great Ones are suffering, Hunters are suffering, everyone is suffering constantly because of a couple of mistakes made by the old Hunters. And the idea that just about everything you fight in this game used to be a human being, it's kind of horrifying to think about. On your first playthrough, you don't even really think of the Hunter's dream as some kind of trap, but the more you think about it, the more you really start to understand why the Hunter's dream is so terrifying. And that leads me to the end of the game. The fight with Gehrman, the first Hunter. The reason that fight is so good and it holds so much weight is because both you and Gehrman are both trying to save each other from a terrible fate. Now, obviously, if you know the story and you come to that choice at the end, your first instinct is going to be, we should relieve Gehrman of this. He really wants to be let out. But perversely, he's also been doing this for a long time, and there's no reason to sacrifice ourselves just so he can be set free, when there's probably not going to be anyone to set us free either. Obviously, if you do fight him and take his spot, the entire fight is filled with this somber, legendary music that really encapsulates exactly what you're fighting about. There aren't really that many fights in media where it's just two guys trying to save each other. And executed well, I guess. The fight isn't even really that difficult, it's more of the mental anguish that you go through while battling him. I've seen other people play through this game and they get mad at Gehrman in the beginning because they know he's going to be a boss later and they truly don't understand what Gehrman is sacrificing in the end. Regardless of the mistakes he's made in life, he has been in this hunter's dream for a very, very long time, with no one to make the choice to relieve him. And even if they do, he will fight tooth and nail to the very end to try and make sure that no one suffers the same fate that he has. I can kind of see why some people say this is the best game of all time, but I still disagree quite strongly. Saying it's your favorite game is completely fine, it's even top 5 for me, but saying it's the best, especially when the story and gameplay are so strict and inaccessible, it just can't be. And if all the other Souls and FromSoft games are like that, then I dare say none of them can truly be the best game of all time, regardless of just how fairly they earn their 10 out of 10 rating, just as Bloodborne definitely has for me. The best game of all time has to maybe not be perfect in every category, but truly great. And Bloodborne simply isn't great in every category, but wow, it really is perfect in most of them. Well, if you enjoyed, I'll ask you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate you watching to this point, and those two things will make me even happier. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.